Catalina Aircraft Company has engineered the amphibious multi-role Orcon to support Marine combat operations and aviation assault roles worldwide. Drawing on the historic legacy of amphibious aviation operations, the Catalina Orcon fills a key role of deploying and keeping Marines on mission. Designed for expanded O-line flight maintenance, the Catalina Orcon is built to sustain the amphibious advantage. Visit catalina-aircraft.com to learn more.
Hey Scuttlebutt listeners, welcome to episode 257. This week we welcome Col Nicholas Reynolds, USMC retired, and Katie Sanders to the Scuttlebutt. Col Reynolds came on our show back in episode 51 to talk about his book, Need to Know, and this is Katie's first time at the Scuttlebutt, and hopefully not the last. Nick and Katie co-authored the book Ortiz's War, the Allies' secret weapon against the Nazis in France, and we couldn't be more excited for this book. Col Peter Ortiz is one of the most fascinating, yet one of the least known Marines in history. However, his exploits are legendary, like something out of a movie. Katie mentioned in a conversation with a Hollywood A-lister that the stories were so fantastic that this actor thought they were made up. One of the biggest challenges of writing a biography of such a warrior is separating the mythology from the legend and keeping his story rooted in fact, not hyperbole. Nick and Katie talked to us about that process, Katie's personal link with Peter Ortiz, the process of co-authoring a book, and who would be the best fit to play Peter Ortiz in a movie. Hint, hint, there needs to be a movie about this Marine. Also, if you're in the National Capital Region on Wednesday, September 2nd, Nick and Katie will be at the International Spy Museum to discuss Peter Ortiz and their book. Before we get started, a quick note. You may notice some choppiness in the audio. We experienced a recording issue in our remote connection, but with the release of the book on the 25th, we felt the conversation was too good not to share. So thanks for bearing with us. This is episode 257. Hey, Scuttlebutt listeners. Thank you for joining us and your continued support. I'm Vic. I'm here with Nancy.
Hey, Vic. How are you?
Good morning to you. I am doing well on this Wednesday morning. Interestingly, we had just finished The Lord of the Rings. Not the whole thing. We finished Fellowship of the Ring.
Okay.
And
reading it or watching?
Reading it.
Yes.
Okay.
The
family and I.
I've never read it.
Yeah. All right. That's our
listeners,
podcast.
I wish
Folks,
you could
we'll
see his
you later.
face right now. He's so disappointed in me. Oh my God.
So, let me tell you, there's this fantastic series of books called Lord of the Rings.
All right.
You should check them out.
I'll make a note of it.
Yeah, you jot it down. It's just by this guy. I think it's he has some initials, J.R.R. Tolkien. Anyways, he's fairly well known, in some circles.
Yeah.
But yeah, check them out. They're really great. But we finished the first we did a family read. So we did Fellowship of the Ring. And sort of one of the deals, sort of the carrots we dangle is, hey, we read the book, then we get to watch the movie. But the thing is, and spoiler alert, is that the movie adaptation kind of cuts into the second book. So parts of the end are the first chapter of the second book. And so now we have to sort of finish chapter 1 of Two Towers before we can watch the movie. Anyways, but one of the things I was thinking about though, because it's old. I think, God, is it coming up on 20 years? Anyways, Viggo Mortensen, one of my favorite actors, does such a wonderful job depicting one of the heroes of the story. So it got me thinking, like, what are some, and obviously these are fictional characters, but like, what are some actors or who are some people in history that you would like to see depicted, and who would you like to see them depicted by?
Oh my God, what a setup! Like,
or
you're brilliant.
Who have you seen depicted well, and by whom? Like Oppenheimer, obviously, was a huge.
Okay, I didn't see that either.
I didn't see it, but I mean, it won, a ton of awards.
I don't have time to actually read fiction or go to movies because you've got me on a very strict schedule of reading books to prepare the podcast.
You just read it?
I know. I did just read that, but it was for the podcast. Okay, so am I allowed to just spoil the entire episode we're about to record and introduce that?
Yes. Well, no,
Okay.
let's not introduce. Let's go through our theories first, though.
Okay.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
and please, our guests weigh in. But so, as it leads into our interview, we'll be talking about this. Like,
What a segue.
Truly, I mean, I don't know, this unbelievable figure in American history.
Swashbuckler.
I mean, truly like a swashbuckler. So Peter Ortiz, and so for folks who don't know the name, Peter Ortiz was a Marine officer who served with the OSS and did all of his time in Europe. And so, many misconceptions are that the Marines were just in the Pacific. Anyhow, and we'll get into some of the details, but if you're a fan of Captain America, as I am, or you watch Inglourious Bastards, like, you kind of mix the two together into a single person, and you've got Peter Ortiz. And so I was thinking, as I'm a huge fan of Viggo Mortensen, I'm also a huge fan of Pedro Pascal. I thought Pedro Pascal would be the perfect person to play Peter Ortiz.
I can definitely see that. I could see what I was thinking, and just hear me out on this, because he doesn't necessarily have the right look, but I think Glenn Powell has the right swagger.
He's got the moxie. He's got a lot of moxie.
He's got the swagger. I mean, you've got to have swagger to play Peter Ortiz.
There's a couple pictures that you'll see, and as we talk about the book that features Peter Ortiz, dives into his life and career. But there's a picture in there, I thought he looked a little bit like Cumberbatch.
Oh yeah. Ooh, good one.
Yeah, I thought Cumberbatch might be a good one too. But I'm just such a huge Pedro Pascal fan. I'm gonna die on that hill.
Okay.
But yeah, I thought Cumberbatch might be a good one too.
Okay, well, these are all good suggestions. Now it's time to ask our guests. What do you guys think?
So our guests today, we're so honored and so happy and so excited. I'm like just moving, like I'm a perpetual motion machine here in my seat. But we're so happy to be welcoming back to the show Col Nicholas Reynolds and his co-author of the book Ortiz's War, Katie Sanders. Thank you so much to both of you for taking the time to come on the show and talk about this wonderful person with this wonderful book.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, welcome to the show. It's really exciting. We've been emailing back and forth for what seems like months now, and so it's really great to be able to talk to you both about this amazing book.
You don't have to put a leg to come talk Peter Ortiz. So.
So who do you guys think would be a good person to play him in a film adaptation?
Well, I never thought of Cumberbatch, but that is not a bad choice. Viggo Mortensen wouldn't be too bad either.
Yeah, he's awesome.
Nick sometimes likes to bring up people who are dead who would be good, and I'm like, that doesn't work, Nick. But he was, again, you just look at the guy, and there's the physical appearance. But I think Benedict Cumberbatch is interesting too, because it's Ortiz was a real thinker. He had linguistic skills that were unmatched. So you need someone who, unless there's some serious AI assistance, can speak French, German, some Arabic, just as easily as he can speak English. He really speaks French like a native. I thought some folks that I'd asked on Instagram said Austin Butler. I thought Austin Butler is, kind of got the look. He rocks that mustache
he's got the look.
nicely. But yeah, you really want someone who just, I think, studies their characters, because Ortiz was someone who ironically was a Hollywood actor, never in a way that you'd say, oh, wow, I knew him from XYZ movie, his amazing appearance. But he was a man of many, skills and talents.
But he's fairly dashing too. Like, he does have
so dashing.
So my grandpa gets shot down. He's a Jewish kid from Queens, 23 years old, told he's on a low-level night mission to supply the resistance, solo, no formation or anything, and he's on his own, separate from his crew, and to get smuggled to the French resistance, these amazing, courageous heroes in the resistance say, we know who to get you to, Chamberlain. Can you imagine being a 23-year-old Jewish kid from New York, looking at, you're told this mission is secret. If you get shot down, you might be tortured and killed as a spy. So the advice that the Air Force gave, don't get shot down. To then find yourself in the presence of, as his code name, Chamberlain, but he introduced himself as Peter Marine. He introduced himself as Peter Ortiz, United States Marine Corps, and was thrilled to see my grandpa there on this mission that was delivering supplies to the resistance. But to have someone who we think is rivaling Glenn Powell and Austin Butler, and that's only the physical appearance, and then is actually a real life knight at the round table. I never knew my grandpa, but he died many decades later feeling like I can die now because I should have died a long time ago.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Well, let's. I mean, because the linkages here are so fascinating. So let's talk about you guys a little bit before we start talking about Peter Ortiz. So, Colonel Reynolds, sir, again, thank you again for coming back to the show. For our listeners, please go back and listen to episode 51, where we talk about Colonel Reynolds' previous book, Need to Know. You're also the best-selling author of Writer, Sailor, Soldier, Spy, featuring Hemingway. So, sir, thank you again so much for coming back to the show. Former grunt, former Marine historian, and was really excited that you were, in on this project. But Katie, yeah, let's talk a lot about you. Let's talk as much or as little or as much as you want about some of your background, because not a former Marine, not a veteran, but you are an award-winning journalist, podcaster. Your list of features span everything from National Geographic to Time, Vanity Fair. So what was sort of, we like to refer to our Marine guests as, what was your path to Yellow Footprints? But I guess it's like, so what was your path to journalism and history and all of these sorts of things that you found yourself in?
Yeah, thanks so much. I grew up in the suburbs of Boston, a very curious kid, often asking questions of my family. Had a very small family and not much sense of, family history really, except that we had this piece of my late grandfather, my mother's father, who is a character in this book. His plane that was shot down in World War II is the cover loop of his B-24 Liberator that he was flying on a secret mission to supply the resistance a month before D-Day. And, again, curious kid plus piece of World War II aircraft, and kind of, just a lot of questions. I'd known that there was maybe some intergenerational connection with the family. Clearly, my grandpa had received this piece of a plane as a present from the crash site that someone had recovered. So again, I sort of knew about it, but not until I really became a journalist and made a living asking questions did I really pursue this one. And I think a big turning point for me, I always say that, like you said, I'm not a Marine. I have such respect for people, like Nick, who've been in uniform and not serving our country. And I, would have never heard the name Peter Ortiz ever, I don't think. Until the Benedict Cumberbatch biopic had come out, or comes out. But I heard his name actually for the first time when I went on this quest to learn more about my grandfather's mission and the people who saved his life. And, he and his crew all survived after parachuting out of their burning plane. And I found myself in Los Angeles at the archives of the UCLA Film and TV Library. And I kind of had a tip from my uncle that my grandfather, who again, like most World War II veterans, especially ones on secret missions, weren't really going around talking about what they had done. But there was an exception. He had gotten a call in 1949 from producers in LA, from NBC, a show called This Is Your Life with Ralph Edwards. It was then a radio show, later, I think, television. And they said, we're featuring this principal subject of the show is this guy, Peter Ortiz. Will you come on? My grandfather's flown in as one of the people to share the story of Ortiz's life, their first reunion post-World War II. And so here I am, 7+ decades later at this point, and really looking to find out more about my grandpa. And in listening to this episode, I press play on this, old cassette that you're like not allowed to record, but can then type up. And I'm listening and I'm like, this just simply must be made up. What do you mean? I'm hearing not only my grandfather's thrilling, wild, hair-raising chapter of Ortiz and his journey through the Pyrenees into Spain, escaping in Gestapo staff cars that Ortiz had personally stolen, this whole wild thing. That is but one chapter of this man's life. And here we are on this radio show, where they've surprised him on set and are bringing people from his life to recount several chapters. And from there, it was like, okay, it's not just, my grandfather was on these missions. They're very interesting. Operation Carpetbagger. I highly recommend, learning about some of this supplying the resistance.
Love the name of
stuff.
that. They give an award to whoever came up with that operation.
Yeah, not the best American history reference. Nick can be our OSS expert and tell you it's a randomly assigned code name with no connotation. However, to me, Carpetbagger is now grubbed of any Civil War affiliation, just as this secret mission that my grandpa Murray Simon was piloting as part of, there were a couple thousand of these missions in 1944 and 1945 to supply the resistance and circuits like Ortiz's. And so anyways, I find myself, just enthralled and turned on to a whole new story. And turns out Nick was learning the story from a different seat and vantage point too, and couldn't help but keep thinking about Peter Ortiz.
And so how did the two of you connect with each other? That is also very interesting, and make that connection that you had a mutual interest.
So I was working, I've had two of the best niche jobs in the U.S. government, I think. One was officer in charge of field history for the Marine Corps, and the other was the historian at the CIA museum, the best museum you never saw. One of my first duties there was to work on the OSS exhibit and to delve into OSS history and, write the scripts, script the exhibit, write the labels and whatnot. And so I kind of got, justly or not, I became known as sort of the OSS guy. So, Katie was in touch with some of the same people at CIA as I was, and somebody said, "Hey, you two need to talk because you're fishing in the same waters." So we had an email relationship for a couple of years where we would talk about, we might discuss something that happened in OSS, or not necessarily related to Ortiz. We only met in person once. I think we mostly email, met in person once for about 10 minutes before the pandemic in front of it was like a spy meeting in front of the New York Public Library patients.
It was more than 10 minutes. We got coffee after, Nick. You're selling us short.
20 minutes. It was brush past. Anyway, so, one thing led to another, and I was finishing up the World War II book on intelligence and started talking about next projects. And Katie said, "Hey, what about Ortiz?" So it went from there.
I think neither of us could let Ortiz go, and Nick maybe also well, first of all, you're selling yourself short as the OSS guy. You're a scholar of OSS, if I've ever met one. And for those who don't know, OSS is 11,000 or so at its peak in 1944. Americans, both civilians and military. Again, my grandpa was sort of de facto OSS, the air arm through his Operation Carpetbagger service, but OSS is doing all sorts of things, very illustrious, an interesting crew led by General Donovan, who Roosevelt refers to as his secret legs at one point. And so of this cast of characters, Peter Ortiz is the most battle-decorated member of the OSS. He was in Hollywood after the war, and John Ford, the director, is godfather to Peter Ortiz's son. And there's all this just amazing history, yet no one really, at least people I was talking to, had ever heard of this guy, Peter Ortiz. So, Nick, maybe the photo on your desk is also something that I think I always come back to. I don't know if we want to go at it now.
So that just let me get back to that in a second. But OSS, CIA has an OSS gallery. OSS Office of Strategic Services is rightly considered the precursor of the CIA. There was no CIA until well after the war. So this is the World War II, stood up in World War II as a central intelligence agency, all lowercase. And so that's the interest, that's the connection right there. And to go back further to my days as an infantry officer, I heard about Ortiz, and I saw this picture of him standing at the funeral of one of the men who died on August, and actually the only guy who died on a Marine who died on August 1st, 1944. And I thought, boy, this is quite something. So behind German lines, they're in uniform, the Germans are closing in, but they could be. And he's taking the time out to have a little formation, a funeral, and render honors to the Marine who died the day before. So I thought that was a stand-up kind of guy. And I was the editor of a publication called the Journal of America's Military Past. and Ben Frank, who was the chief historian of the Marine Corps at the time, said, would I publish his article on Ortiz in the journal? So I liked Ben's article. I liked it so much I made it the cover story. I liked that picture so much I put that on the front cover, and then I framed it and kept it on my desk. So, when I got in touch with Katie a couple of decades later, it was still there.
The short answer is the CIA introduced us.
And so when was it like instant once you guys realized you had this shared passion for Peter Ortiz, like we're writing a book together? Or was that like how did that evolve?
I had to convince him. I still have to do some convincing to, make Nick feel that this, he's someone who has written books before, and I spent many years, thinking I was going to write a book, The Pilot, the Doctor, and the Spy, Ortiz being sort of the spy, which Nick would correct and say he's more of a secret agent than a spy, more of a saboteur or a commando. But, for the sake of how to share this story, when I met Nick, I was really compelled by his expertise. I'm someone who real life is stranger than fiction and getting it right, and going deep in these archives. Nick can read French and get by in some German much more effectively than I can. And I think just through a series of, like you said, we were pen pals. We would bring each other, hey, have you seen this or that? But we sort of knew in the back. I mean, he obviously knew I had this weird connection to Ortiz. I then went and visited Pete Jr., who's also a retired Marine aviator, flew in Desert Storm, and retired history teacher. So there's just a lot of threads and synergies. And I really felt like with Nick bringing, his expertise as a biographer, and my interest in really, intertwining in the story some of this narrative of Ortiz's humanity and the connections through the years, and my, personal experience learning about the carpetbaggers, we could be a good team.
So I'm Mr. Footnote, right? And so I have a tendency to write to my footnotes. And so the great thing about teaming with Katie is Katie could bring some life into that and say, hey, do you think you might want to rephrase that a little bit to put the person first, and then maybe put the fact or the background down in the footnote? So
we did let you keep the footnotes. We kept the footnotes, and you said the best compliment of his life would be if someone said, "Oh, I saw your end note," or "I saw your footnote." And
so actually,
there are some great ones.
That's true. One of the reviews that I liked for my World War II book was even the footnotes are interesting. So, I sent that person a free membership in a golf club.
Nice.
I can't remember.
I mean, also just add to that, and then I'll let you jump back in, but that with Ortiz's story, there have been so many different accounts of it over the years, so many different retellings, and oftentimes, what was written in True magazine in 1946, whether or not it was true, sort of gets repeated. And so I think partnering with Nick, we've sort of had this opportunity to say, all right, there's been a lot of stuff written. There's still a lot of room to introduce people to this guy. How do we get on the record, by as close as we can get to the primary accounts, to the archives, like what really happened? You see this in a lot of the stories. I mean, it didn't, even before social media, like the story of Ortiz and the bar scene we can talk about later, the amount of iterations where you're just like,
I love that story.
Yes, but which version is the question?
Right.
And it's
Your
an amazing
version.
story.
Oh,
Okay,
wow.
well,
Your
thank you.
version.
That's the one I'm sticking to.
So to revert to my character of Mr. Footnote, we wanted these things to be documented so people could say, okay, look, they have carefully looked at this version, that version, how the various, how are these stories substantiated? Is there corroboration of this story? And so we think it's important. We feel strongly that it's important to have those. They're actually endnotes, not footnotes, so they don't litter the page. But we want people to be able to go and say, okay, this is as close as we're going to get to the truth of what actually happened on that day. And there are some great stories about Ortiz, and we just couldn't substantiate them. So they went to the back of the book in an appendix, an honorable mention. This could have happened, but it could also be a C story. And I think most of our
Wait, sir, hold on really quick. Before we get, so you're trying to say that Marines embellish? Sir, what is happening here? What are you
Yeah,
talking about?
take my commission away.
And they never put themselves at the center of the story either. They're like to
Yeah.
swap in, for any other branch of reference.
He's we have gone over his stuff pretty much with a fine-tooth comb, and he is not as far as we can tell, he is not where we know for sure, where we have two sources on a subject. One of them is his and one of them is somebody else's. He's not a big embellisher. Sometimes he gets a fact a little bit wrong. He records a name not quite right, or he says he did this in 1928 when it was probably 27 or 29.
He did a lot of stuff. We'll give him a break. Yeah.
Yeah,
but no, he's got a full pack.
Shooter. Yeah.
One of the things I just want to jump in real quick here. I just love this book, and there are a couple of sort of tells when I'm reading a book and I think it's amazing. And one of those is whoever is in the room with me or anywhere nearby, I stop them. I don't really care what they're doing. And in this case, it was my husband trying to fly an airplane. And I'm like, you got to hear this. You got to hear this. And I'm reading him passages of the book over the head, like waiting for a break in air traffic control. Like, you got to hear this. And reading little bits of it. This is a book, and I told everyone this summer that I talked to about books, like, this is a nonfiction book that reads like a fiction adventure. It's so good. It's so interesting. It's so much fun to read. I loved learning more about Ortiz. I had first heard about Peter Ortiz back in maybe 2008, 9, 10, something like that, when a previous book about him came out, and we ran an excerpt about it in the magazine. And the thing that stuck with me for all these years, and I saw it again in your book, I'm paraphrasing the quote, but where Ortiz was deemed not fit for any desk job ever.
You made that whole quote in Leatherneck. I know it because I always repeat it. I think of Laura Lacey's book, which we should shout out Laura to Live a Man's Life, because she really, spent some time with the Ortiz family.
Yes. And Laura is so awesome.
And I think Major Spooner should also get a shout out too, because he, I think, was really the one who has been an evangelist. I mean, he's a Marine who served in the Pacific in World War II, but also a real Marine storyteller. And I remember my clothes will never smell the same after spending some time in Golden Laurel Cigar Lounge with him. But, he really opened me up to a different angle of Ortiz, had gotten to know Ortiz's widow. Ortiz wasn't going to be the one telling you about his story. He didn't go back to France, whereas all these other Marines who participated in Union 2, his big final mission, did. So you really rely on the, public awareness campaigns, if you will, of people like Major Spooner, like Laura, who are able to, before it's too late. Jean Ortiz, his widow, really took it upon herself to help surface the story too, to get some people on the record in France. And so Laura, I think that not a good candidate for a desk job ever quote.
That was
so fitting. And it's tucked in the files. Nick, you probably read a lot of these files on both ends of your careers. But when you see lines like that, you're like, I get what that means. And it really does mean that.
Yeah.
So this is a psychologist sitting in Washington, sort of doing interviews of guys coming back from the battlefield, looking to find the next job for them. And, he kind of distills Ortiz after talking to him and reading some of his answers that he put down on paper and coming to this conclusion. So good on you. I can't remember his name. I think it's Commander Cohen. Good on you, Commander, for distilling in 2 or 3 sentences the essence of this man.
Yeah, and it doesn't take psychoanalysts to, look at his timeline of this kid who dropped out of fancy French boarding school to join the French Foreign Legion as maybe, speaks a bunch of languages, but not gonna get his diploma anytime soon.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Echodyne's high-fidelity radars for maritime missions ensure expeditionary forces maintain decision advantage from shore to sea. Rapidly scale, evolve, and maneuver. Echodyne is trusted by defense organizations worldwide. Learn more at echodyne.com.
And now we're back. I want to dive into some of the logistics. As an aspiring author, and aspiring is actually probably insult to any aspirations. But if what is it like to co-author? So one of my favorite authors,
Good question, Vic.
Sci-fi nerd, is James S.A. Corey, which is the pseudonym of two authors, Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank. What is it like to co-author, and how does that work? So, Colonel Reynolds, you mentioned Mr. Footnote. So, Katie, do you add in, like, do you do the narrative that backs up? Like, how does it work? How's the?
That is an
I got
awesome
I
question.
get all the odd chapters. You do all the even chapters.
Well,
I wish. No.
We talked about various ways of doing that and decided against even and odd, so that we would just have one voice. But let me start by saying we both did a lot of the research, and it overlapped. We had slightly different approaches. Katie excels at finding people or their descendants and going and visiting with them and then saying, oh, by the way, do you mind if we look in the attic? Which I generally don't do. And the place where I'm really at home is the archive, and, one more file, one more footnote, one more reference until we get to the wonderful references like the one we were talking about, never suited for a desk job. So what we wound up doing was writer, mostly me, and then Katie, editor, taking my clunky prose and editing it, suggesting ways to make it flow more smoothly.
Yeah, Nick's a beautiful writer. I think he really comes at things from the perspective of an Oxford trained PhD military historian who has a background as a Marine and, as a scholar. For me, I write for readers of, more general interest. I would say, like, I don't have academic journal author credits, for example. Like, writing for me is more about, Nancy, that feeling of, first of all, I'm very sorry to your husband that we distracted him while he was operating a plane. I
hope he landed
autopilot
okay.
was available. I'm glad we're all here. I would feel very bad if this book had somehow been, involved in the distracting of
what a way to go.
I mean, we would never know, I guess, the black box. But anyways.
Can you imagine the sales we'd get out of that?
Well, Nick, let's not be too opportunistic. So for me, it really is about finding, for me, I wanted to repeat the story so desperately because I think it's important and interesting. And so, sharing it with people, working with Nick, who's really able to construct and reconstruct. I just went to France and went to all these places that Nick described geographically, and it's like, oh yeah, I see it now, but I can't believe he did this without being there. I'm much more of a reporter where I'm like, I'm going to spend a lot of time being a fly on the wall. I'm going to ask you questions about your family. And yes, by the way, did they happen to write any letters or have a scrapbook? And we can talk more about some of the fruits of that, which are now in a couple museums, because there was stuff and is stuff
that's so cool.
Remembering Ristler's logbook. So Jack Ristler was on Union 2, Ortiz's final mission, this jump into France that we opened the book with. Very intense operation after D-Day, but weeks before Operation Dragoon, the Southern Allied landing. So these guys are on this really perilous mission. As Nick mentioned, Marine Charles Perry dies on the jump, 22-year-old who's static line. We think the cable snaps, no backup from 400 feet. There's hole in the ground in France where his lifeless body is. Brother was a Marine, by the way, and he'd become a Marine paratrooper to be like his brother. And so you have this high stakes mission. Then you have I won't give away the whole book, but there's a situation where Ristler and Ortiz and Marine John Bodnar become prisoners of war, and they spend 9 months in captivity. And for those who are familiar with prisoner of war diaries at all, there's this type of diary called a prisoner of war logbook that actually people are often surprised, like the size of an iPad or a Bible, are issued by the International Red Cross to give prisoners, a space and a notebook to not only write but draw their experiences. And turns out Jack Ristler, this, 23-year-old from Davenport, Iowa, is a great artist. And so he drew the war, and he drew not only, the war, the planes and the air raids he was hearing overhead, but he drew his barracks. He drew Marlaug Nord, the camp they're in. He drew the fellow POWs he's with in their caricatures. So you can now see that logbook. I just did a National Geographic feature on it digitally. And Neil Rissler, who pulled it out and said, yeah, my dad had this. And he has now donated it generously to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, which has seen a lot of World War II logbooks, POW logbooks. They collect them, but never has the curator there seen one from an OSS agent, because they weren't usually OSS Marines. We're a rare breed. So yeah, that's really, it pays to go to people's houses, Nick. It really does.
I agree.
So what I hear you're saying, Katie, is that Vic and I need to take a trip to New Orleans to see the World War II Museum.
And
that's what I hear.
And France.
Oh, and France too. That's what I'm hearing.
For it's the November National World War II Museum annual international conference on World War II, and I think the Marines should certainly be represented. And we'll be speaking about Ortiz's war there. Nick brought some OSS expertise to the event last year, but yeah, they're even at the World War II Museum in New Orleans, amazing museum. It's there's not some large section on OSS Marines because there weren't many OSS Marines in Europe. So.
Could I comment a little bit about these OSS Marines? So apart from Ortiz and Coolidge, the two officers who had time in the French Foreign Legion, the other people on the mission are not combat veterans. Okay, they had never been in combat before, and these Marines had been trained fairly well. They were para-Marines, so they went to boot camp, they went to Marine Corps jump school, and then they were sent to Europe. And initially they trained with the British Special Operations Executive. So essentially they go to boot camp again. So, and then they're trained in the dark arts of special operations, and then they're dropped into France.
First, they become teachers, though, Nick. I think it's worth saying that these guys are actually assigned to be the instructors teaching the Ortizes and the agents to jump. And then Ortiz actually says, hey, Marines in Europe, Marines in London who are jump trained, do you want to jump on this mission with me? And like you said, Francis Coolidge, the Air Force captain, is also from Ortiz's network. He recognizes him from the French Foreign Legion, where they had been in North Africa together. So Ortiz, Jack Rissler, whose logbook I was talking about, recognizes Peter Ortiz, again, this pretty easy to recognize swashbuckling guy who's just come back from the first mission where he bumped into and escorted out my grandpa, and he's ready to go back. He says to, Marines, Rissler, great, you're here. You interested in a job? And Rissler recognized Peter Ortiz from when Rissler was a parachute instructor, and Ortiz had enlisted as a Marine at back in the States earlier in World War II. And he says, I remember this very weird Marine who showed up to jump school already more trained than the teacher.
So anyway, when these guys get into combat, even though they don't have this background, they do a terrific job. It's like they with their training, their trainers, they're being trained, and it all works so well. So they kind of validate the special ops theory of life that you get this highly trained individual, and he can do things that on the battlefield that not everyone else can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's good to see the ROI on that for sure. And I got to imagine too that there had to have been some calculus going on there, because you're on a sort of a timeline, because you need these guys in the field as soon as possible. Most of the war was extremely fraught until really, even Market Garden after D-Day goes completely pear-shaped. So just because you have a foothold in Europe doesn't mean that the Nazis are just going to capitulate. So I got to imagine that there was a lot of discussion about get these guys out there, or do we get them really well trained? And it seems like they went with the latter, and it paid off.
Yeah, in this case, there were other cases of people who weren't as well trained, who were pushed out and did not do as well.
Yeah, but Nick, even looking at the August 1st jump of the guys on that mission, again, they're people Ortiz has recruited. All of them but one are Marines. The one who's not a Marine, Francis Coolidge, is actually Thomas Jefferson's great-great-great-grandson, who served in the French Legion, and Ortiz recognizes from there. But by the end of the war, 2 of the 7 are dead. And you know, you think of just what paratrooping and these special ops, you know, what goes into it, and you know, one dies on the jump, and another dies in actually a carpetbagger mission later in the war in the air. So as well, that's going well, right? But it's not a statistic I'd want my kids, you know, jumping into it again.
Right. These low-level jumps are not what your mom wanted you to do.
Yeah.
No room for a backup. No room for, and you're not allowed to like be telling the details of anything you're doing to anyone back home. So your mom doesn't know what you're doing, probably for better. But when you're missing, she doesn't know any of the circumstances.
Right.
War Department might not even know. In my grandfather's case, he got back before the War Department had informed, you know, his mother that he was home. And so a reporter came to her door in New York and said, you know, your son is missing in action. How are you doing? And my grandfather answered the door. And that was just, you know, giving the chain of command and the mail and all of this communication. So these guys were operating in code. They had BBC ads that were cueing the resistance, that they were coming. It was really like, you know, pretty unique warfare.
That's a great cinematic moment. You know, the guys, the mailman's coming with the, I'm sorry, your son is lost, and the son is the one answering the door.
Which thankfully the reporter knew this, and I can send you the picture because the reporter said, "Can you wait here and put your uniform on because I'm going to go get a photographer?" And they have like, you know, mother and son reuniting pictures that for me are you know, obviously so precious. But imagine the
what a scoop too.
Fun. Yeah, right. You know something before the government does, and it's unlike a lot of news in World War II, happy news. It's pretty. I think of Charles Perry, whose mother for years was unclear on where his body, you know, what the state of it was. And the reality is that, you know, we now know the French people, the resistance was receiving these men. They're overjoyed. Not only are they receiving men, they're receiving more than 800 canisters, these giant parachute affixed canisters that have supplies and arms in them. So it's like Christmas came early for the French resistance in the mountains that are going to finally have some weapons to, you know, hopefully fend off the Germans. And so in the midst of all this joy, you know, Whistler's getting French kisses on the cheeks, there's their dead friend. And like Nick said, you know, it was such a moment of character. Ortiz, you know, Ortiz and Bouilly, Captain Jean Bouilly, who is the leader of the Bouilly battalion in France, or French resistance in the region Ortiz is working closely with, they hold a full funeral, full military honors at, you know, the site where Perry has jumped to his death. So even if his mother didn't know it at the time, people in La Cessy where he jumped every year show up and really tend to that grave, or did while it was still there, and do so with the utmost respect. These women sewed flags overnight to put French and American flags, flowers. A photographer named Raymond Bertrand photographed it for us to see. And so you have this, you know, Marine who dies, and, you know, no one's forgetting it. I think he really is remembered there to this day.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, well, Katie, I'm curious about your family connection, which I find so interesting, your family connection to this amazing character in history. What has the response been from your family about the research, the things you've uncovered, and, you know, ultimately this book that you've written?
Yeah, it's a great question. And my parents have been so supportive, even though, you know, growing up, I think my grandfather died, you know, we might call it an untimely death. He was 61 from smoking, you know, Air Force pilot, you know, old habits die hard. But again, I think on his deathbed had something my mom told me in this process of kind of getting to know my grandfather and getting to know Ortiz, was that he had said to my mom, you know, look, Jane, it's actually like he's diagnosed with terminal cancer. He's, you know, kind of the glue of their family, the patriarch. He's dying. He says, look, Jane, I've been living on borrowed time since I was a 23-year-old who jumped into France and got out. And, you know, he didn't talk like that normally, but it was this feeling of so moments like that where I was really able to, you know, get to know my grandpa through my mom. I also get to know my mom, who grew up with a dad who was actually, a tool entrepreneur doing business in Japan, which is in and of itself really interesting to me. Ortiz and the Ortiz family connection to me has been so special. Peter Ortiz visited my grandpa and brought Pete Jr. when my grandpa was living in Philadelphia. Pete Jr. was at the time a student at the Naval Academy, and my grandpa was in Philadelphia, and he said, "Hey, you want to ride back from your spring break?" and flew him back in his, it wasn't a Piper Navajo, whatever little plane my grandpa was lucky enough to have as his, the plane he lived to fly because of Peter Ortiz, so that they could continue that connection. But my mom would have never told me about that. It wasn't like something that would have come up. And then what was also really special was learning about who my grandfather was, and who shaped him, like these figures in his life and this service. Uncle Sam shaped him. When I showed up at Pete Jr.'s door, I think it might have been the Marine Corps birthday. I had no idea that this was like, I should be walking. It should not be walking. But he'd invited me for Memorial Day or for, Veterans Day weekend. That was when I drove to see him for the first time. And, he opened the door and he took my bag and he's like, your family now, you know that, right? And that feeling of embrace was
nice.
Just,
Wow.
really, it was sort of like, wait a minute, I'm here because of your dad's heroism, and so are a lot of people, and
Just got chills.
I hate when he tries to pay the bill, because I'm like, Pete, your family saved mine, I'll pay the bill. So
Wow.
Well, Colonel Reynolds, so I got a question for you on this. I find it really interesting. You guys had mentioned in the book when you're talking about, Peter Ortiz's sort of backstory, that he went from private to lieutenant at graduation. Like, hey, there's this guy here, even sending letters up to the commandant, like, hey, these guys needs to be an officer. This dude is insane. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. I don't think they talked like that back in the 40s. But it also makes me think about sort of some of the other unbelievable Marine Corps stories in American history. We talked earlier about Archibald Gillespie. What is it about the Marine Corps, and what is it about some of these like sort of special missions, or what is it about these special missions that Marines are kind of ideally suited to fulfill, and why do these characters keep coming up with EGAs on their lapels?
So I'm a member of a group of retired officers, all infantry officers, starting in the 1970s and a couple even before that. And we had a similar conversation the other day, more or less along these lines. And it's like, what is it about the Marine Corps that enables it every so often to be really nimble and do the right thing for people? And the answer we came up with was the Marine Corps basically starts out as a regiment, and people think like they're part of a regiment that keeps on growing. And so there's this attitude that the colonel knows all the captains and lieutenants and has a personal connection with them. So that's kind of what we see here in Ortiz's amazing beginning in the Marine Corps, where he walks into the recruiting station in Baltimore, and he doesn't say anything about his background because he just wants to get in the service, even though he's got all this military experience at that point. And so he goes at like any other private, except he's 10 years older, and then he gets noticed down there. And so instead of, he's basically the honor graduate of his platoon. And instead of getting a single stripe, becoming a PFC, he becomes a second lieutenant USMCR. So I think it really speaks volumes about the Marine Corps' ability to kind of, when it makes sense, to put that record, to put the regulations aside and say, hey, we have a terrific opportunity here, and let's make the most of it.
I'd say that's also really an OSS thing of like knowing when to break the rules, and when to innovate. And you see Sterling Hayden as another example of a Marine who is in the OSS, and also happens to be, he would actually be a great Peter Ortiz if he were a modern actor. They have a knack for Hollywood handsome hero guys, I guess. But again, it's this mix of Marine and OSS that's like there's some sense of things that haven't necessarily been done before, unprecedented times calling for innovation. That, OSS heritage and lineage is really about that. And you see there were, I think, 5,000 Marines in Europe in World War II, and everyone's like, there were Marines in Europe in World War II, and 5,000 is not a big number compared to what we think of as World War II Pacific, of course, and it wasn't. But 5,000, that's 5,000 stories.
Yeah.
And in that, you have these OSS Marines who are sort of pioneering some of the earliest, even scuba diving, for example, and like the Navy SEALs and, what we think of now as, Green Beret tactics, guerrilla warfare. So the Marines were willing to innovate and work together, and sort of, for me, it was a little startup-y to see how they were coming together to do this.
Well, that's interesting then. So we're talking about, I guess, this really almost fictional character. Was that a challenge then when writing the book to not overly romanticize, or to not and I know we sort of, again, we'll joke about the, Mr. Footnote thing and the due diligence, but even with that authenticity and validation, it still it's hard to believe. So what were some of the challenges in writing this that you did not want to overly romanticize it, but at the same time, it is extremely romanticized. You want to tell this story. I don't know. It seems really challenging.
Nick's probably sick of hearing me say show don't tell, but really, the challenge was in having what you show not come off as overly romanticized when it is in fact true. Maybe we can use the bar scene as a
I was going to ask you about that, because especially in Marine Corps mythology, we would love for that to be like, oh, and they started handing out wedgies to everybody and gave everybody a high and tight. That's.
I mean, look, people can believe, everybody, has their versions of the stories they hear. But there is a particular, if you've heard of Peter Ortiz and you're a Marine, you've maybe heard this story of, Peter Ortiz walks into a bar in Nazi-occupied France. And just to orient everyone, this is, Operation Union is Ortiz's first deep penetration inter-allied mission. No other Marines with him. He's with, French and SOE British operators, super secret agency stuff. But Ortiz is sort of next level. In addition to just arming and mobilizing the French resistance from the Maquis, he's like, well, while I'm here, I'm actually going to dress up as a French pro-Vichy fashion designer, Paris guy who maybe seems really effeminate, sit at a bar and, get drinks from my German friends over there. And little do they know I'm eavesdropping on them. And he did things like this. He did things like these little side missions. Nick does a really good job capturing in his French Foreign Legion days. It was like he had some self-assigned, it wasn't just orders. It was, he gave himself, things that he thought would be useful, like stealing Gestapo staff cars or blowing stuff up.
As one does.
I feel like blowing something up
the Gestapo staff cars would come into handy when he needed to drive out of France with my grandpa. He's a real actor in that way, a performer. He can put on. There's a great photo in his SOE file of like him and what you have to think is how he kind of looked and speaks French like a native. His father is an founding editor of Vogue Paris. Like he's a classy kind of, also can be
he's
amusing
sophisticated.
guy.
He's sophisticated for sure.
Yeah, of course. He speaks all these languages. He's been, he has DuPont blood, like he's high society and can go in. And I think that was a perfect character when he wasn't pretending to be a minor Vichy government official. He was pretending to be a fashion designer. Anyways, little do they know, there's this American Marine. But the Germans are starting to get wind of, actually, we're hearing about this really distinct, good-looking guy in Marine uniform going around. He wore his uniform in the field sometimes to make a point, both to give the Allies and the French people hope that there were Allied uniforms there, but also to show the Germans, like, you don't have to wait till D-Day to see that there's some presence here. And so anyways, bar scene, for Marines who've heard this story, it's a story about a toast. You're talking spring 1944. Ortiz is, the jig is up. He's pretty identifiable at this point. He's getting recalled sooner rather than later. So what does he do? But he decides, in his own words, as chronicled after the war, to pull a little trick on his German pals he's been drinking with. So he goes into the bar on this evening, the nightclub, and is ordering, there's at the bar drinks for these at this point unarmed German officers because they're at their watering hole in Nazi-occupied France in spring of 1944, and again, don't have their pistols on them. And so Ortiz actually does have his pistol on him. He also has under his cloak or jacket, whatever he's wearing, his uniform. And so some show that he's there as an American. So as his
audacious.
Yes, audacious to like thrill-seeking, hair-raising, amygdala clearly is like triggered by this, thrill. And so he goes in, stands at the bar. The guys, he's sick of them hailing Hitler. So many, and I don't know what language he's doing this in, probably German, I would imagine. I don't know. And he says, look, we've drank to Hitler a few too many times. I'm going to propose a toast to FDR. And again, I'm really sorry, Marines. Sometimes the Marine version of the story is, I'm going to toast to FDR, then to the Marine Corps. As Ortiz tells the story, which is the version we share in the book, he says, I'm going to propose a toast to FDR. Obviously, the Germans are stunned. They have a pistol on them. He shows his uniform. They see this is the guy people have been talking about that is literally been sitting there drinking with him. So yeah, he blows his cover and holds the gun on them. At this point, I think these Germans, if I were them, I'd fear for my life. However, he's not one to go commit a war crime and shoot anyone, in cold blood like that, as he puts it. And so he has them toast to FDR and then reveals himself as Peter Ortiz, American Marine, backs out. And, they think that he has the whole place cased. There's going to be like a mob of resistance who come in. No, it's just one resistance getaway driver who they make their way out. Nick, how'd I do? Was that Ortiz's version of the story?
That's pretty much Ortiz's version. So the struggle or the question for the historian is, how much can you trust Ortiz here? And as I said earlier, we think he's pretty much a straight shooter when he is telling stories like this that really sound like war stories that Marines have all heard in the bars, so I think the Marines will know the difference between a sea story and a true story. And we have some documentation that from other people who had who independent witnesses who say Ortiz was going to the bars, hanging out with the Germans, and this is documentation from that time. The further you get from a particular event, the less reliable the documentation.
Sure.
So, we're willing to take Ortiz at his word here, and we also imagine that if he had in fact shot the Germans, that's something that would have made the French press. There would have been big posters. The Germans would have had a massive search for him. They were looking for him already, but it would have really turned up the heat. So we're willing to go with the Ortiz version here, even though it is the most cinematic version imaginable.
And I think he gives some context to why he did what he did. First of all, I think it was very important for Ortiz. He hated the recountings that included shooting somebody because, again, shooting someone in cold blood was, he's a very honorable actor, and that was the opposite of that. So I think it deeply offended him from what, I've come to understand, that he would seem to do something senseless like that. But bold, yes, and that he wanted the Germans to know that there was a presence, right? That he actually, it's sort of psychological warfare, right? It's like D-Day, it's coming, and now you really feel it in your bones.
He became like the Nazi boogeyman.
Truly, and it was driving them nuts. It was like up there with Virginia Hall of like just these like, in our plain sight, can't squash, but and honestly, Ortiz, there are a lot of close calls, a lot. And, he narrowly escapes many a time until he doesn't. And he, like people show up at doors looking for him, then he's just left a lot. We find that like the chase and the dates are all a little, hard to pinpoint exactly, but a lot of close calls. And that network really does get blown. And his radio operator dies at the end of right as he's leaving town before D-Day. And by the way, he is spying. He's picking up intelligence. The Germans are talking at the bars and they're not tight-lipped. And he's sending that intelligence when he can back to OSS headquarters. And again, they want him back before D-Day. They want to know what's going on the ground. And so he's recalled.
Man.
Besides the famous bar story, which I mean that really takes the cake, are there any other little anecdotes from Ortiz that obviously we want people to go read the book, so we don't want to give everything away, but is there any other anecdote that you'd want to share that are, kind of stand out in your mind as kind of, favorites?
Well, we want to invite the reader to pay particular attention to sort of the climax of the book, which is where so basically it's a fire team reinforced, right? There's 6 infantrymen with light weapons confronting what amounts to a company of Germans mounted in trucks with much heavier weapons, and they give this great accounting of themselves. So we'd love for the readers to focus on that and to see how it played out and to appreciate just how much this small group of Marines, reinforced with 1 Army guy and 1 French resistor, were able to accomplish.
Yeah, I would also just say, like, as you read the book, if you just identify moments of decision, disaster, crisis, like how Ortiz operates. Nick has taught me to, study his reactions to things and look at, again, like Nick said, he's a leader who, has a funeral for a fallen comrade in a context where it would have been acceptable not to. And in fact, understandable. He's a leader who is always looking, as we've been saying, he's gravitationally pulled toward the eye of the storm. He's pulled towards crisis even after the war. Like if there's, needy kids, he wants to help bring snacks, or if there's a hurricane, he's going to be there for relief. Like and I think in that sense, both the French Foreign Legion and the Marines, it's this fit of, he sees his service to society. His son said that this frame of nobility obligates, like he grew up with a lot of privilege, and squandering it was not, an option. It was more about seeing opportunities to be in service to others as an obligation.
Yeah, I found that was one of the narrative threads that I really found extremely compelling in the book. It was that, on the surface, and of course, as Nick can attest to, everyone loves to hear the Marine shit. But I think the thing that's really compelling about this is his, even though he may come off as a loose cannon, he's so grounded in ethics. Like his ethical code and his moral code are unwavering. And so I really found that so great. And to reference, that final story, I mean, that is where I think the narrative of his life comes to a crossroads, and it's so fulfilling the way you guys have that. On that note, though, I do want to ask, and at the risk of, I guess, being a little controversial, I find it interesting. I know it's weird. I must have
I'm excited.
I must have too much coffee. I find there's a real draw to, as we're talking about romanticizing these great men in history, especially as we lean into the word men, there's a real tendency to romanticize the things that they've done. But on the converse, we have, and I guess I'll juxtapose, like, say, Harriet Tubman versus Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So, obviously Harriet Tubman is most well known as an abolitionist, but we know very little about what she was doing as a spy for the North. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is known for being a part of the assassination attempt on Hitler, but we know very little, like, oh, well, he was a Lutheran minister who went to the United States and, all about his growth and his faith. What were some of the challenges, I guess, going back to the romanticizing of this, but what were some of the things that you saw that you wanted to stay away from as you were portraying this? And what are some of your thoughts on how we consume these historical figures as the sort of the people that your audience that you're targeting?
So I tend to be just the facts guy who wants to be. I don't want to romanticize him, and I think I think the picture is bolder and more compelling if we take a look at what happened after the war, this is a man who is the ultimate warrior, and his abilities and his potential are maximized in World War II. And he himself did say this. He said, "Look, I'm no peacetime soldier. I'm a wartime guy. I don't do peacetime soldiering." And so after the war, I see him not reaching the same levels of excellence that he met as a warrior during the war. And I think that humanizes him. I think that makes it makes what he did during the war all the more compelling.
He tries and he gets turned down, time and time again, both in military context and in Hollywood. Again, Ortiz reunites with my grandpa in 1949. This is, 4 years after the war, and he's at this point working on some movies with Warner Brothers, and sort of John Ford is at his side. You'd think like this is someone who's gonna crush it in Hollywood. Look at him, but he doesn't for a variety of reasons. But a couple years later, we find this newspaper listing: TV winner seeks job. Talking about this guy who was sort of. Ortiz had put a classified ad saying looking for work. He, was a bit meandering. He lived in Mexico, did some teaching there. There's some talk of had Bill Donovan taken over or been in leadership at the CIA, which he never was. There was no, that was not a clean transfer. There were a lot of OSS people who worked at CIA. Ortiz, in another context, again, Nick's the CIA expert, like you could see definitely he was hungering for the field, but because he was sort of part of Donovan's old stable of these leading operators, unlike Coolidge, who did parachute in with him, and goes on to work at CIA for a very long time. Like he does not go on to be the operator that we know of that you'd think he would. There were a lot of questions as we were writing the book. Laura came across this too, of he sort of disappears for a while, and then he's, showing up here, and what about, did he pay in cash? And, Ortiz actually had so many wounds at that point. He was in a lot of pain clinics. There were a lot of things that were hard about his life later on. And when my mom met Ortiz, her grandfather had said, Jane, you're going to meet a real life knight at the round table. And I remember my mom's reaction was he was less of the, I think, warrior my grandpa had met in World War II, and a little more of a hollowed out, gentler soul who was in pain. He has shrapnel on his back and surgeries and his hand, all these wounds that really made the rest of his life painful. But he also didn't quite fit. And again, in the end of the book, we talk about he offers himself to the then Secretary of State as a hostage exchange for any person they want to send back, any innocent prisoner who is being held hostage. And this is Nick now, the 80s, 70s. And the Secretary of State kind of first ignores and politely declines, but there's not really room for him.
This is a noble thing for him to do. It's a noble gesture, but it's not really real life.
Right.
The people who go on these missions are the ones who stayed plugged in, right? You call the guy you call the guy who's been on your Rolodex for years, not somebody who's written in. So it was a quixotic gesture, and good on him for doing it. But I say it wasn't real life.
He strikes me as one of these people who everything came together at the right time for him to achieve the sorts of things that he did, and kind of one of these people who you just want to freeze and break glass in case of emergency and just bring him out when you need him, because that personality and that set of skills is so rare to have all of that together. And I've known, maybe not quite to the level of Peter Ortiz, but I've known one or two veterans. In fact, my father-in-law is one such person who, and we always said about him, World War II happened at the right time for him, or, who knows what would have become of him. But he excelled as a fighter pilot because the circumstances were there for him. And then he had, a couple of other post-war exploits, but he just never really was able to shift back over into normal humdrum day-to-day life. And speaking of Marines like that, I've mentioned on the show before, Black Sheep Squadron fighter pilot Chris McGee was one such person who also just could never get back into the swing of what that sort of normal day-to-day, not in combat life was like. He just really excelled in the field, or in the sky in his case, but just being an adventure seeker and having a certain set of skills doesn't really lend itself well to punching a time card like Fred Flintstone at the factory.
You see it a lot.
I think you put it. I think that's a great way to put it, Nancy. Have him break glass in case of need. You don't want a Marine Corps. You don't want 100,000 Ortizes in the Marine Corps. It wouldn't work. But you want to have a few Ortizes for when you really need a specific skill set in a specific situation, and that's who he was.
Yeah, the crisis operators. I think you look at MARSOC today, you look at some of these, even Ortiz's Hall, the building that was recently dedicated, there are these niche areas of the military where it's kind of amalgamation. It's very non-traditional. Like he's a crisis operator in a very particular context. I thought it was very interesting that Ortiz's Hall, Nick maybe can speak better than I to like what the lineage that we're talking about is, but from my understanding, Ortiz Hall houses officers who are working largely in cyber, behind the scenes, really important work, but less so, on the ground. And that having someone like Ortiz as, kind of a founding father or someone to connect your lineage to, you can imagine that the impact of the work you're doing extends far beyond the computers that you're sitting at or the offices that you're in. And so I thought it was really kind of interesting that someone who's not a good candidate for a desk job ever is sort of like a really a leading figure for this particular group.
Yeah, that is fascinating.
Yeah, for sure.
That's good. Well, sir, Colonel Reynolds and Katie, thank you guys so much for coming on. I could probably sit here and talk to you guys for another 2 hours about this. This is so great, but I will do one better and encourage everyone to dive into this book, Ortiz's War, the remarkable true story of OSS saboteur Peter J. Ortiz, the Allies' secret weapon against the Nazis in France. So good. And, in some ways it's kind of a softball because of like we talked about, just the unbelievable comic book nature of his life in service. But you guys did such a great job in the way you handled it that it definitely does not come off as something that is overly sensationalized. So thank you for writing this, and thank you for coming on to talk about it. And we are so excited for its release on August 25th.
25th?
Yeah.
And just real quick, where can people find the book? Where can they find you? And also, shameless plug, there's an excerpt of the book in the October issue of Leatherneck. But other than that, where can people find the book?
In addition to the October issue of Leatherneck, thank you so much. And this great podcast, you can find the book wherever books are sold. We're at Ortiz's War Book on Instagram. If you want to contribute to the Who Should Play Ortiz in a Hollywood biopic thread, we love it.
Hit us in the chats.
I just want to say, as someone who's a journalist and, unlike Nick, not a Marine, and has been entering the space of that you occupy of, sharing incredible stories of the Marines and incredible history, I want to shout out real quick. Semper Reeds is amazing. Stephen Ramirez, I know he's been on the show.
Friend of the show.
Also,
yeah.
Captain Isaac Lambert, who has overshadowed. And
we're talking to him on Friday, actually. He'll be in studio.
Tune into that episode too. His book is more, kind of a coffee table style book of a broader picture of
beautiful.
Marines in,
So
in
well
places
done.
like Europe, really important. And then last one I would say that I read recently that I loved that was by a Marine and about, among other people, Marines, is Courage Can Save Us by Ry Barcott, who is, again, was a Marine who now has a nonprofit called With Honor. And in it, he profiles people who have gone from being veterans who have entered public service, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, all of them sort of connected through their paths of service. I think it's really, it's been neat to be brought into this rich Marine history that I, again, have been so enriched by. So thank you.
Well, those are great recommendations. We'll definitely check them out, folks. You heard it here first. Yeah, check these books out. It's really great. These are some really great stories. So,
Nick, I feel like you have to give a book rec now because I gave too many. What's your Marine book rec?
How about Need to Know?
Need to know.
I hear it's good.
No argument there. So, yeah, there are a lot of terrific books. I mean, I dove into the French Resistance, so some of my faves come out of the French Resistance when I did research for this, and also books about Americans in the French Foreign Legion. There's a guy named Doty who wrote a book in the 1920s about American guys serving in the French Foreign Legion. So I'd invite you. And there's I can't think of the title off the top of my head, but it's Undercover Paris, I believe. Just an amazing story of what it's like to live in France and to work undercover for the Allies. So, and as soon as we hang up, I'll think of some great Marine Corps stories that.
Okay. We'll drop them in the show description, sir, if you send them to us.
All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much.
Thank you
Have a
both so
wonderful
much.
day, and
Good to
we'll look
meet
forward
you
to seeing
both.
you
I'll meet you
in
again.
September, hopefully.
September 2nd
All right.
Yes,
at the
September
Spy
2nd.
Museum.
We'll be there. We'll see you.
All right.
With your Ortiz's. Thank you so much again.
All right. Have a great day, you guys.
Bye bye.
All right.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Thanks. Bye.
Scuttlebutt is a production of the Marine Corps Association. You have heard the voices or contributions from Major Vic Rubel, USMC retired, Nancy Lichman, William Truding, and our guest. Ty Frazier is the editor, sound engineer, and technical producer. The Marine Corps Association is not an agency of the U.S. government. The opinions expressed in this episode are the personal views of the participants and do not reflect the official position of the United States Marine Corps, the Department of Defense, or the Marine Corps Association.